August 17, 1945, Camp Eldorado, Texas. The war had been over for exactly 3 months, but 22-year-old Greta Hoffmann still thought of herself as the enemy. She stood at the barbed wire fence line during evening count, staring at the endless Texas horizon, when she heard the foreman calling for volunteers. "Need 3 girls for kitchen work at the Morrison ranch. Pay is 50 cents and supper." Her bunkmate, Anna, grabbed her sleeve. "Don't," she whispered. "They're testing us, seeing which ones will collaborate." Everything Greta had been taught said accepting help from Americans meant betrayal. She was a German woman, a prisoner of war, a representative of the Reich even in defeat. But the foreman wasn't what she expected. He wasn't a soldier. He was a rancher, weathered face, dusty boots, speaking slow English like he had all the time in the world. When he smiled and tipped his hat, Greta felt something crack inside her, because the gesture was kind, and everything about being a prisoner of war said that was impossible. But before we dive deeper into this buried story of women who became prisoners in Texas and chose to stay, subscribe to the channel and leave a comment telling me where you're watching from. The female German POWs arrived in Texas like ghosts nobody expected. Nurses, secretaries, radio operators, women who'd served the Wehrmacht in non-combat roles and were captured during the Allied advance. America didn't quite know what to do with them. Male POWs worked the fields and factories. There were camps for that across 46 states. But women? The government quietly scattered them across rural detention camps in the South and Southwest, places so remote most Americans didn't know they existed. Camp Eldorado sat 40 miles outside San Antonio, surrounded by cattle ranches, mesquite brush, and people who'd never met a German, much less imprisoned one. For Greta Hoffmann, Texas created a cognitive dissonance so profound it rewrote everything she understood about enemies, loyalty, and home. Greta had spent her entire adult life in service to Germany. At 17, she joined the Nachrichtenhelferinnen, the Wehrmacht's female communications auxiliaries, because that's what good German girls did in 1940. She'd monitored radio signals, transcribed orders, and never questioned whether the cause was just. Her supervisor, Frau Steinberg, had been clear. "We serve the fatherland. Everything else is sentiment." Greta had believed her. Why wouldn't she? Frau Steinberg wore an iron cross. She was an authority, someone you trusted. But now, standing in the Texas dust, with the foreman's kind eyes still lingering in her mind, Greta watched 3 American ranch wives pull up in a truck. They climbed out slowly, uncertain, carrying baskets covered with checkered cloth. One of them, an older woman with sun-spotted hands, approached the fence and called out in broken German, "We brought Kuchen, cake?" Then she held up the basket and stepped back, giving them space. "It's a trick," Anna muttered. "They want to see if we'll take charity, if we'll humiliate ourselves." But a younger prisoner, barely 18 and homesick beyond words, walked to the fence and accepted the basket through the wire dowel. The American women didn't laugh, didn't jeer. The older one just nodded and said, "Welcome to Texas, honey." That night, Greta sat in the barracks eating apple cake while Anna wept. In a neighboring section of the camp, 26-year-old Margaret Brandt had a different first encounter. She'd been assigned to mending detail, sewing torn uniforms for the camp staff, when a young cowboy arrived to pick up his father's repaired work shirts. The moment he stepped into the room and saw her, Margaret froze. He was young, maybe 23, sunburned. He held his hat in both hands like he was entering a church. "Ma'am," he said quietly, "my daddy says you did fine work on these. Wanted me to say thank you proper." In Nazi Germany, prisoners weren't thanked. They were used. The contradiction made no sense in Margaret's understanding of how war worked, how captivity worked, how the world worked. The cowboy, whose name she'd later learn was James Carver from a ranch near Brackettville, saw the confusion in her eyes. He set down a small bag of pecans on the table. "From our trees," he said. "Mama thought y'all might like 'em." Then he left, boots quiet on the wooden floor. Margaret stared at the pecans for 20 minutes, unable to reconcile the gift with everything she knew about being a prisoner, about being German, about Texas being the land of her enemies. Margaret stared at those pecans until the guard called lights out. She couldn't have known that the journey bringing her to this moment had been designed, bureaucratically speaking, to be unremarkable. The women arrived in 3 waves between April and July 1945, shipped across the Atlantic on repurposed troop transports alongside wounded American soldiers heading home. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. German prisoners sharing mess halls with the men they'd been trained to kill. But the women were kept separate below deck, where the air smelled of diesel and vomit, and the engines drowned out conversation. Greta made the crossing in late May. She'd expected overcrowding, starvation rations, maybe worse. The propaganda office in Berlin had always been clear about American brutality. Prison camps where Germans were worked to death, denied medical care, treated as subhuman. Instead, she got 3 meals a day. Thin soup and hard bread, yes, but regular, consistent. More food than she'd seen in the final 6 months of the war. That was the first crack in her expectations. The second came when they docked in Norfolk, Virginia, and were loaded onto trains heading southwest. Greta had pictured shackles, armed guards, cattle cars, like the ones she'd seen at stations back home. The ones nobody talked about. Instead, they rode in passenger cars with wooden seats and windows they could open. The guards were bored, young, more interested in playing cards than watching the women. Through the glass, Greta watched America roll past. Farmland untouched by bombs, bridges intact, towns with lights on. It looked like Germany used to look, before everything broke. Camp Eldorado had been a civilian conservation corps facility during the Depression. Barracks built for young men planting trees and digging ditches. When the War Department repurposed it in 1944, they added fencing, guard towers, and administrative buildings, but the bones remained utilitarian, almost gentle. The women were assigned 6 to a barracks. Thin mattresses, 2 blankets each, a wood stove for winter. They were given work assignments, laundry, mending, kitchen detail, and paid nominal wages in camp scrip they could use at the commissary for soap, writing paper, cigarettes. It was, by any objective measure, a prison. But it was cleaner than the bunkers they'd left behind in Germany, safer than the cities being divided by occupation forces, and quieter than anywhere Greta had lived since 1939. Anna summed it up one night, voice flat with disbelief. "We lost the war and got sent to a place with plumbing that works." The other women laughed, but it was the kind of laughter that comes when irony cuts too close to grief. Because the truth none of them said aloud was this: they'd been captured by the enemy and shipped to a foreign land, and somehow, impossibly, they felt less like prisoners here than they had in the fatherland they'd served. That realization didn't sit comfortably. The discomfort lasted about 2 weeks. Then Mrs. Eleanor Morrison showed up at the camp administrator's office asking if any of the German girls knew how to preserve tomatoes. Her regular help had moved to Houston for factory work, and she had 60 bushels going soft in the August heat. 3 women volunteered. Greta was one of them. The Morrison Ranch sat 12 miles from camp, accessible by a dirt road that turned the army truck into a dust-covered rattletrap. When they arrived, Mrs. Morrison, a woman in her 50s with hands like leather and a voice that carried across acres, looked them over once and said, "Y'all know how to work a knife?" Greta nodded. "Good. Let's get to it." They spent 8 hours in a sweltering kitchen, blanching and jarring tomatoes, while Mrs. Morrison explained, in slow English supplemented with vigorous hand gestures, exactly how she wanted the jars sealed. By noon, she'd switched to teaching them words. Tomato, knife, hot, careful, good job. When the work ended, she fed them chicken fried steak and mashed potatoes at her family table. Her husband, a quiet man with sun-carved lines around his eyes, said grace in English. Nobody translated, but Greta bowed her head anyway. As they ate, Mrs. Morrison's teenage son asked, in painfully slow German pulled from a phrasebook, "Do you have cowboys in Germany?" The women looked at each other and laughed. The first real laughter Greta had heard since capture. "Nine," Margaret said. "No cowboys, only soldiers." The boy grinned. "That's sad." Before they left, he placed his work hat on Margaret's head, too big, brim falling over her eyes. "Now you're Texan," he announced. A rancher named Pete Dalton hired Anna to help his wife with bookkeeping. Turned out Anna had worked accounts in Stuttgart. The wife, Clara, taught her English using grocery lists and radio programs. Within a month, Anna was listening to The Lone Ranger and explaining the plot to the other women in rapid German. On Sundays, some of the local church women received permission to hold a hymn sing at the camp. They brought sheet music, a battered piano, and voices that shook the barracks. The German women knew different hymns, different words, but the melodies were close enough. By the third week, they were harmonizing, Amazing Grace in 2 languages, overlapping like a prayer with an echo. Greta learned to say y'all before she learned to conjugate irregular verbs. She discovered that Texans measured distance in time, not miles. She tasted her first Dr. Pepper and thought it was medicine. When the woman laughed at her face, she laughed too. One evening, after a long day mending fences on the Morrison property, Mr. Morrison drove them back to camp in his truck. As the sun set over the plains, he said, "Y'all do good work, real good." Greta understood enough to say, "Thank you." He nodded. "Your folks back home, they'd be proud." She didn't correct him, didn't say that her folks back home would call this collaboration betrayal. Because, in that truck, watching Texas turn gold under the dying light, Greta felt something she hadn't felt in years. She felt human. It started with a letter Anna couldn't send. She'd been writing to her mother in Hamburg, or what remained of Hamburg, trying to explain what Texas felt like, what the people were like, how strange it was to be treated like a person instead of a prisoner. She'd filled 3 pages before she realized what she was really trying to say. She scratched it out at the bottom in handwriting that surprised her with its certainty. "I don't want to come home." That night, she read it aloud to the other women in her barracks. The silence lasted maybe 10 seconds. Then Margaret said quietly, "I've been thinking the same thing." So had Greta. So had most of them. Within a week, the conversations that had been whispered in corners became open discussions during mess hall, during work details, during the long evenings when the women sat outside and watched the Texas stars. They compared notes like cartographers mapping forbidden territory. Margaret had been seeing James Carver, the cowboy with the pecans, on Sundays when his family came to pick her up for church. Nothing improper, always chaperoned. But the way he looked at her felt like a future. Another woman, Liesel, had received a marriage proposal from a widowed rancher who needed help raising his 2 daughters. He'd been awkward about it, hat literally in hands, but sincere. Greta hadn't fallen in love, not yet, but she'd fallen in love with the place. The openness, the lack of rubble, the possibility. Anna, always the organizer, always the one with the clearest handwriting, drafted a petition. It was 1 page, respectful, direct, to the camp administrator and U.S. Army Command. "We, the undersigned German POWs of Camp Eldorado, respectfully request permission to remain in the United States following our official repatriation date. Many of us have formed attachments to this community. Some have received marriage proposals from American citizens. We wish to build our futures here, as Texans. 43 women signed it. When Anna handed it to Captain William DeMarco, the camp administrator, his face went through several expressions in rapid succession. Confusion, disbelief, something that might have been amusement, then bureaucratic panic. This is... He set the paper down like it might combust. This is not how repatriation works. We know, Anna said in her careful English. That's why we ask. DeMarco sent the petition up the chain of command, where it landed on desks increasingly far from Texas and increasingly close to Washington. Somewhere along that journey, it leaked. The San Antonio Express ran the story first. German POW women asked to stay in Texas, want to marry cowboys. Then the AP picked it up. By the end of the week, the story had gone national. Journalists arrived at Camp Eldorado with cameras and notebooks, shouting questions through the fence. Which one of you wants to marry a cowboy? Do you feel guilty about abandoning Germany? Are you doing this for love or convenience? Anna stood at the fence line and answered in the same calm voice she'd used with Captain DeMarco. We are doing this because Texas gave us kindness when it didn't have to, and we want to give something back. The reporter wrote it down word for word, but behind the scenes, teletype machines were already chattering with a different message. Repatriation orders are non-negotiable. Prepare for deportation proceedings. Idealism, it turned out, had paperwork, and paperwork had no heart. The letters started arriving 3 days after the San Antonio Express ran the story. Captain DeMarco opened the first one at his desk, read 2 sentences, and locked it in a drawer. By the end of the week, he had 47 more just like it. Some typed on official letterhead. Others scrawled in angry handwriting that pressed so hard it tore through the paper. One letter, from a veterans organization in Dallas, was particularly blunt. We defeated Germany. We don't owe them our hospitality, our jobs, or our sons. DeMarco called Anna into his office and showed her a carefully selected few, the ones without profanity. I need you to understand what you've started, he said quietly. This isn't just paperwork anymore. This is political. Anna read in silence, her face unreadable. When she finished, she folded the letters precisely and handed them back. We expected this, she said. The military's position arrived in a classified memo 2 weeks later. Greta saw DeMarco's face when he read it, watched the bureaucratic mask slip just long enough to reveal something like regret. The orders were clear. All female POWs were to be repatriated by December 1945. No exceptions. Marriage to American citizens would not be considered grounds for exemption under current enemy alien restrictions. Furthermore, any American citizens found to be unduly fraternizing with POWs would be investigated for potential collaboration. When DeMarco called a camp assembly to deliver the news, he stuck to the script. Professional, apologetic, final. Mrs. Eleanor Morrison showed up at DeMarco's office the next morning with a delegation. 5 ranch wives, 2 reverends, and Pete Dalton, who ran the largest cattle operation in the county. They didn't have an appointment. We're not asking you to change them, Pete Dalton interrupted. We're asking you to delay them, file them slowly, make mistakes on the paperwork. You know how military bureaucracy works. Things get lost. DeMarco stared at them. You're asking me to deliberately obstruct federal orders. We're asking you to give these women time, one of the reverends said. Time to marry. Time to secure legal sponsorship. Time for their American husbands to petition for their status. Half the county didn't spend 8 hours a day working alongside these girls, Mrs. Morrison shot back. Half the county didn't watch them cry when the news came from Germany about what's left of their hometowns. We did. The room went quiet. I can't promise anything, DeMarco finally said. Mrs. Morrison smiled. That's not a no. Inside the camp, a different battle was unfolding. Liesel, who'd accepted the widower's proposal, found herself arguing with her bunkmate, Christina, who'd signed the petition but now wanted her name removed. "You're staying for comfort," Christina said, voice shaking, "while our people are starving in the rubble." "I'm staying because I have nothing to go back to," Liesel shot back. "My city is gone. My family is gone. What am I supposed to rebuild from?" "Your country." "My country built camps." Liesel's voice dropped to a whisper. "You know what I mean. The other camps. The ones we weren't supposed to talk about." The silence that followed was suffocating. Christina looked away. "That's not why you're staying. You're staying because he has a ranch and a house, and you're tired of being cold and hungry." "Maybe," Liesel said. "Is that so wrong? To choose a future instead of a past?" Others doubled down. Margaret and James Carver applied for a marriage license, knowing it might be denied. Anna started taking night classes in English from one of the church women, determined to prove she could assimilate. And Greta stood at the fence line one evening, watching the Texas sunset, and realized she was mourning two places at once: the Germany that no longer existed, and the Texas she might never get to keep. "Dearest Anna, I received your letter. I confess I read it 3 times before I understood what you were telling me. You're staying in America. You're not coming home. I should be angry. Part of me is. You're my daughter, and Germany needs every hand to rebuild. But I'm also relieved, and that relief makes me feel like a traitor. The city is unrecognizable. Our street is gone. Not damaged, Anna. Gone. Wiped clean as if it never existed. Your father's shop, the bakery where you bought bread as a girl, the park where you played, all rubble. I live with your aunt now in 2 rooms we share with another family. So I'm relieved you're somewhere whole, somewhere you can have a future, even if that future is far from me. Does that make me a terrible mother, or just an honest one? Write when you can. Tell me about Texas. Help me imagine a place where the buildings still stand." Anna folded the letter carefully and placed it in the small wooden box where she kept her important documents: work permit, residency application, baptismal certificate. Then she sat at the boarding house desk and wrote back, describing the ranch, the endless sky, the way the cattle moved like a slow river across the plains. Liesel's wedding was smaller, quieter. The widower, Thomas Hart, was a private man, and the ceremony reflected that. Justice of the peace. 2 witnesses pulled from the street. Afterward, Thomas took her to the ranch she'd now call home and introduced her to his daughters, 8 and 11, watching her with identical, suspicious eyes. By February 1946, 31 women had been repatriated. 14 had married American citizens and remained in legal limbo, their status under review. 6 were living as sponsored laborers, like Anna, waiting for permits that might never come. 2 had simply vanished, slipped away into the vastness of America with false names and forged papers, choosing invisibility over deportation. And Greta stood at the fence line one last time, watching the sun set over the Texas plains, and made her choice. She'd found work at a hospital in San Antonio. No marriage, no ranch family to sponsor her. Just her nursing training and a supervisor willing to bend the rules. She wrote one final letter to her brother in Munich. "I am staying. I don't know if this makes me brave or a coward. But I know I can't come back to a place that only exists in memory. So I'm building something new instead. Forgive me, or don't. Either way, I'm staying." She signed it, sealed it, and walked into her American life. Margaret Carver lived on that ranch outside Brackettville for 43 years. She raised 2 children, learned to rope cattle with the same hands that once transcribed Wehrmacht communications, and became, by most accounts, more Texan than the Texans. She never lost her accent. When she died in 1988, The local paper ran an obituary that mentioned her service in the German military in a single sentence, buried in the third paragraph. The rest was about her work with the church, her prize-winning peach preserves, and the scholarship fund she'd established for local students. Her son, asked years later what it was like growing up with a German mother in Texas, said simply, "She was just Mom." But it hadn't been simple. Not for her. Not for any of them. Anna never did get full citizenship. Her residency permit was approved in 1947, renewed every few years with diminishing scrutiny until the bureaucrats seemed to forget she needed renewing at all. She worked as Pete Dalton's bookkeeper until he retired, then for his son, then for his grandson. She never married. When asked why, she'd say, "I married Texas instead." People thought she was joking. In 1982, a graduate student from UT Austin tracked her down for an oral history project on POW camps. Anna, by then in her 60s, agreed to one interview. She spoke for 3 hours, careful and precise, choosing her words like she was still writing that first petition. Near the end, the student asked, "Do you have regrets?" Anna was quiet for a long time. "I regret that choosing life felt like betrayal," she finally said. "I regret that staying meant leaving. But I don't regret staying." The student didn't understand the distinction. Anna didn't expect her to. Liesl Hart raised Thomas's daughters as her own. It took years. The older one didn't call her mother until she was 17, but eventually the house felt less like an arrangement and more like a family. She tried to teach her daughters German, but they resisted, embarrassed by the language, by the association. Eventually, she stopped trying. On the flight back to Texas, Liesl realized she'd been homesick the entire time. Homesick for a place that hadn't been her home in 18 years. She never went back again. Greta worked at the San Antonio hospital until she retired in 1979. She became a U.S. citizen in 1954, not through marriage or sponsorship, but through the slow, legitimate channels of immigration law. She framed the certificate and hung it in her small apartment next to a single photograph. Herself at 19 in her Nachrichtenhelferinnen uniform. Someone she barely recognized. She attended a POW reunion once in 1971, organized by a historian researching the camp. Only 7 women came. They sat in a hotel conference room in San Antonio, drinking bad coffee and trying to explain to each other what the last 26 years had been. Some had children, some had divorces, some had buried husbands. All of them had carried the weight of being both victim and perpetrator, prisoner and collaborator, German and Texan, neither and both. "Do you think we were right?" someone asked. "To stay?" No one answered directly, but Margaret said, "I think we were human, and humans choose survival." It wasn't absolution, but it was something. History doesn't record most of their names. The official records list them as repatriated or residency granted, or sometimes not at all. Administrative errors, lost files, women who slipped through the cracks of bureaucracy and became invisible. But their children remember. Their grandchildren carry DNA that bridges continents. The churches still have the old photographs. German women in the choir, standing next to ranch wives, singing hymns in 2 languages. In Bracketville, there's a small cemetery where Margaret is buried. Her headstone lists 2 dates and 1 hyphenated name, Margaret Hoffmann Carver. Both identities, neither erased. War divides nations with borders and treaties and terms of surrender. But it reveals hearts in smaller ways, in the quiet decision to offer food to the hungry, to teach language to strangers, to see the person behind the enemy. These women came to Texas as prisoners, carrying the weight of a country that had chosen darkness, sent by a regime that had committed atrocities none of them could justify or escape. They didn't come seeking forgiveness. Most knew they didn't deserve it. But Texas offered something different. Not forgiveness, that wasn't Texas's to give, but a chance, a possibility. A sunset over open plains and the radical notion that people could be more than their worst moments, their worst governments, their worst selves. Some took that chance, some didn't. Both choices carried costs that compounded over decades. They came as prisoners of war, but some stayed as pioneers of a different kind, cartographers of forgiveness, navigators of guilt, architects of small redemptions built one kind gesture, one shared meal, one difficult choice at a time. The Texas sun still sets the same way it did in 1945, wide and gold and impossibly vast. And somewhere in the distance, if you listen carefully, you can still hear the cattle bells.